In Beyond the Boundary, you make the connection between democracy and, I think, cricket. How important is Beyond the Boundary for you?
I don't know that I made a connection in that way between democracy and cricket. What I referred to was that the development of democracy coincided with, and in my opinion, affected the development of cricket. That is a different thing from what some might think, that in cricket there is democracy now.
Oh no! I thought the whole question of the Athenian democracy grew up around the whole question of sports.
Yes.
And you make that connection between what is the manifestation of sports and its sort of correlative.
Democracy in Western civilization, in Britain and the Dominion. Yes, certainly. I think that the two are very close.
But in Garfield Sobers, you also seem, in your last article a few Sundays ago, you talk about Garfield Sobers, and you said about him that the command of the rising ball and the drive, his close fielding, and his hurling himself into his fast bowling are a living embodiment of countries of a tortured history.
That is the embodiment of the Caribbean people. Now, I can't go into that in detail, but you see I've mentioned there the fast bowling. Western Britain don't produce any fast bowling.
Gilchrist, West Hall.
But today, the West Indian cricketers produce the fast bowlers and they come here. Now that is part of the West Indian history, this capacity. And it is not only physical capacity, but this desire to project the ball and to project yourself. That is part of cricket in West Indian history.
And part of their social history too.
Part of their social history, the desire to be effective in a world where you are a newcomer and you have nothing but the physical strength that you had from years of working as slaves. So they become, that's why the fast bowlers come from the Caribbean, but they don't come from England, so that the English teams have to send to the Caribbean for fast bowlers.
People speak of Beyond the Boundary, for example, as being the classic analysis of Trinidad and Tobago, and by extension Caribbean society, in terms of not just sport, but sport in relation to issues of class, in relation to issues of color, in relation to issues of social organization of different sporting clubs and so on. And so it was, in a very real sense, not only a description of some of his own life experiences, it was also a description and an analysis of how Trinidad and Tobago society is organized, both in a formal and informal way. And he used cricket and he used the clubs and social organizations around cricket to describe that. He used cricket to describe the relationships between classes. So when he spoke, for example, of Matthew Bondsman as a cricketer, obviously an ordinary working class, very poor Afro-Trinidadian, he was using Matthew Bondsman as the example of the affirmation of expression of the individual through how Matthew Bondsman batted and played cricket shots and so on. And so James, I think, had a very good understanding of our society, but this understanding of our society goes back to even earlier times, before he had come to know and develop the dialectical method. So in his novel Minty Alley, it was a description of life in a barrack yards and life amongst a particular socioeconomic group of working people, of the lower middle classes and working people, of aspirations of people, as reflected in some of the characters who thought they were better than the others in the barrack yard and so on. And he did that through his literature of a novel. If you look, for example, at Black Jacobins, again written before he really had a thorough grasp of dialectics, before one could say he was a leading Marxist theoretician. Black Jacobins analyzes slavery and Haitian society, both as historical, and but not just history as date and time and place and characters, but history in terms of the dynamics of social forces, of class, of race, in the which categories would have been sharpest in slave society, and in slave society in Santo Domingo, which was the jewel of all slave societies and of plantation economy. So right throughout his life, James was really concerned about people. I think that was the centrality of it. He was concerned about people about happiness and as well, and which is why he loved film and became a fan not in a sense of unthinking or uncritical viewer of films, but he became a fan of Hollywood, of American films, because he understood that through film stories were being told about human experiences, not just on the personal or individual level, but in relation to social movements, in relation to moments in time of societies and how societies were dealing with fundamental questions. So from the earliest time of Mintiali, we've written here in Trinidad and Tobago, when in the very early 30s, and his involvement in the Biko group, where you had other writers who were also writing about that period. Pitch Lake, written by Alfred Menz and so on, about the period of the 30s. A very, very important literary contributions from an artist's perspective of how society is constructed, what were the concerns, what were the issues. Every Cook Could Govern, written again very, very early on in his life, in his political and thinking life. Every Cook Could Govern, pointing to the role of the working people. And if you look, for example, at the piece he did on Captain Cipriani and so on. So that seemed to be in James's preoccupation, how he expressed that preoccupation about understanding societies. At various points he may have done it differently, though there was a common thread right throughout. So he did it through a novel to start off with, then historical work, a novel of Black Jacobins, and then later on through more detailed formal analyses of society, through the semi-autobiographical Beyond the Boundary. Various media were used by James to constantly analyze people and the movement of people, and he was very cognizant of the movement of people as being the central driver of social change, because he had to understand not only the world in which he lived. I think that was then his point of departure when he became a revolutionary, when he came to Marxism and so on. The earlier thing was descriptive of societies, in terms so that his sociology was descriptive, but then he moved beyond that to understanding society, and therefore what we use the word driver now, what are the forces that bring about fundamental change over the long historical sweep. And then he became revolutionary in the sense of his sociology, because he was not only seeking to describe, he was now seeking to identify motive forces for change, and to look at societies at particular times and say, this is, in my best view and judgment, the motive force for change. And these are the forces that are opposing change, and this is what is likely to happen in the conflict, and so on. In looking at the West Indian middle classes, of course, he talked about not only their role but in society, but famous, a very important phrase, and James of course, his use of language was something else. But he said that they knew nothing. And he said they're not involved in production, So they don't know anything about production, and they know nothing. And I think his comment, therefore, about them knowing nothing, although obviously they're educated people, was a critique of the education system, of the colonial education system, of which, of course, he was a product and perhaps one of the best products in that sense. Though he never went on to university. I remember him saying, you know, somebody asked him, why did you go to university? And his response was, with a laugh, of course, who would teach me? Right? A characteristic Jamesian statement. But he while he was a product of the colonial education system, and many parts of him still were imbued with it, in many respects he was able to escape from the confines of it. And I just, some time ago I was reading some of his letters from London. You know, he wrote some articles for the Trinidad Guardian, I think it was, when he left Trinidad and went to London. Yes. He was supposed to write to earn some money. The letters from London. Yes. And he was in those letters describing his experiences in London society, in the artistic and intellectual circles in which he found himself very, very early, sometimes quite by accident, and I suppose some of the quote-unquote bohemian circles and that kind of thing, and was making the point that he really was, while he thought he was at a disadvantage to the colonial educated, the colonials themselves who were educated, he found that with few exceptions, none could challenge him intellectually in terms of his grasp and range of and understanding of art and music and history and a whole range of other things. I think that then gave him a sense of affirmation about not only his own identity in the world, but also an understanding that what he would have been taught as being superior was in fact not superior. And which is why he pointed to the importance of Froude, another Froude, of J.J. Thomas, John Jacob Thomas, who several generations before him wrote a critique of Professor Anthony Froude, who was the then one of the well-known anthropologists and so on in England, who essentially wrote that we are subnormal people, and J.J. Thomas wrote a stinging critique of that. And James recognized from Froude's writing and so on that we have an identity of our own, that we are equal to and in many ways superior to those who colonized us. So there was this constant preoccupation of understanding ourselves, not only in our own context and the motive forces and so on, but also in relation to other peoples, about global movements. And that is why I think he came to the point that he said, you know, we are a modern society, and in fact we can bring about change that will demonstrate to the rest of the world a new civilization. He didn't put it in those terms, I don't remember putting it in those terms, but essentially that we can bring about a new civilization, a civilization that is superior to that of the imperial civilizations that colonized and oppressed and exploited us. And so there was this constant analysis of ourselves as a society, the motive forces for change within our societies, and then our societies in relation to others. What we now would talk about globalization. He picked that up very early and was able to analyze other societies. And when for example, he went to the United States in the period of the Second World War, from my understanding of that period of his life, he went and lived in the rural South amongst sharecroppers and so on, and to get a real understanding of life. I think it's suppose it's a paradox, because I remember him living in Trinidad at one of our union properties in the late 70s and so on. He was supposed to be writing his autobiography. He started, didn't finish it and so on. But never being totally comfortable. Although he said, you know, we like to eat local food and so on, so on, so on. He also had a sense that he had a longing for things that were British, you know. But on the other hand, he, in the United States, he went to live amongst ordinary folks to understand that society and therefore to be able to write about it. And so he knew that theory could never, which of course is a critical understanding of dialectics and so on, that theory could never be divorced from practice, and that practice must inform theory, and that therefore to understand what is taking place, one actually has to understand what people are saying, what people are doing, and to pick up on those things and to translate that into a general understanding of what the society is doing and where it is going. So he was not by any means a person or academic who was abstracted. He was very much involved in the process and so on. So when you went to speak to him when he was in London, and you went to speak to him for a short while, he would be asking you what is happening, who's doing what. And he said, well, I heard this one said that, what does that mean? You know, and he would ask very penetrating questions because he was trying to piece together an understanding of what was taking place in the society, on the ground, in official circles, and so on, in order to be able to make an analysis and therefore come to certain conclusions. Now, he was wrong about certain things. I think he was wrong about Michael Manley, because one time he was singing the praises of Michael. He wrote a little pamphlet about Manley and so on. I think he made some mistakes about Garner and Rawlins. I think he was very excited, but there was a process on the way in Garner in the initial period in Rawlins with the grassroots organizations of what was it called, PCNDs and that kind of thing, of people's organizations and people's assemblies. We were very excited about that and thought that that was what Rawlins was organizing and pushing, but he did, I don't think, understood all the facts at the time. So yes, James made mistakes, and that therefore does not diminish the value of his work and of his contribution and of the value of his methodology. And if, for example, you read some things that Lloyd Best said, Lloyd said that the one person who he respected highly as having a very good understanding of our society was James. And Best himself was in that tradition of trying to develop an indigenous sociology that was all embracing, that sought to understand our own reality from our own perspective and not necessarily from the analysis and perspective of others. In terms of economy, plantation economy, and many other aspects of it and so on. And James did that. And James was not unidimensional. So that when people describe James, you have to use many different adjectives to describe him. So he was not unidimensional because he recognized that human beings are not unidimensional. Human beings are spiritual, and they express themselves artistically, or they relate to artistic expression in particular ways. They have families, they engage in production, whole range of things. And therefore, to understand the complexity of the human being and of society, one had to understand it from a multidimensional perspective, and certainly that was James. And if you look at some of the other original thinkers, John LaRose, for example, a Trinidadian, Lennox Pear, who many people would not know about outside Trinidad and Tobago, but who was another radical revolutionary activist. They were involved in the arts, in steel band, in music, and so on, as well as in politics, as well as in trade unionism with the workers. All of that multi-dimensional, multifaceted. And I think that therefore the intellectual tradition of your J.J. Thomas, of your CLR James, of your John LaRose, of your Lennox Pear, of your Lloyd Best, and so on, that intellectual tradition is a very important intellectual tradition. And what we are making the mistake of doing in universities, in the academies, in the formal academies, in the way in which we teach our children, is to separate learning into subjects which become silos. So you learn economics, and you're an economist, but you have no understanding of what is history, or you have no understanding of politics, or you have no understanding of what is taught as sociology, and vice versa for all of those. And I don't think that we could come to a clear understanding of Caribbean society, and by extension of other societies, if we are unidimensional in that way. And so James brought clarity of method. I think this is his most enduring legacy, a clarity of method to enable us to try to continue to study and understand our societies, but with a view always to change it,
Yes.
because he was Marxist, and therefore he would have held to the position that it is not enough to know the world, one has to then change it. And he committed his life to bring about that change. And while one could say that he did not succeed in that sense, in others, if you are clearer, more careful analysis of his contribution, one would have to say that there were successes. So that the whole struggle for independence in the Caribbean, the struggle for independence in Africa, those struggles were informed by the work of James.
Yes.
So that Williams, who led the formal struggle, not the initial struggle, because the initial struggle was led by workers in the 20s and 30s and 40s. Williams came afterwards. But the formal part of the transfer to independence and so on, Williams was influenced by James. James was there, and so on. The whole federal project, James was there, and so on. And Nkrumah, and Nkrumah's relationship with Padmore more centrally, but James as well. And of course, Nkrumah in the context of Ghana being the first African country to get its independence 50 years ago this year. So we have to look at James's legacy and success and measure it in different ways. His contribution to the whole movement of the so-called civil rights movement in the 60s and so on. James would have made important contributions, by his presence in the United States at an earlier time. So I think to artists, to individual writers and thinkers, a lot of people were influenced by his work, or by coming into contact with him and sharing and exchanging. And the other point, last point I really want to make is that James always held that it is going to be the working people, the working classes, who are going to lead the fundamental transformation of Caribbean and world societies. Never let that go. Till his dying day, that is what he held on to, which is why he also asked the Oil Fields Workers Trade Union to be responsible for his burial.
Okay.
And so we took that responsibility which he gave us and took charge of and organized his funeral and his burial. And it was more than symbolic. It was because he felt that the only class in the society that could do that properly, in that sense, were the oil workers. And so I think it was more than just symbolic.
Yes.
It was an affirmation of what he believed in all of the years. And so when we look at what is taking place in Caribbean society today, we need to look importantly at what is happening with working people, and to understand that, and to understand the role of the middle classes and the role of the ruling elite, the owners and masters of capital.
Yes, I think he made that point in American Civilization, where he celebrated the workers, the ordinary people.
Yes.
So much so that you would think that he's celebrating and praising America as an empire. And that kind of is a little uncomfortable for somebody coming from his ideological, political positions. But I find that attitude also present in his review of Hegel's dialectics. Unlike James, I haven't read anything critical that he said about the dialectics of Hegel. It's all praise, praise, praise as the person who started it. But
yes, but then I think, Notes on Dialectics is not an easy thing to read. So So I'm not going to profess to be an expert on notes on dialectics. I did read it, but it's a very important theoretical work. My understanding of what he was saying is that yes, Hegel laid the foundation in terms of laying out dialectical thought, which he said could only come, and this is an important thing too, that ideology could only arise in the context of the moment in time of history, in terms of what is taking place in the society. So that Hegel's thought could only emerge in the period of European Enlightenment, could not have emerged at any other time, and therefore was a product of a process of European philosophical thought and so on. But he went on to say that, well, my understanding of what he went on to say is that while Hegel brought us to this point, Marx then took us to another level. Now, he didn't therefore critique Hegel or condemn Hegel in that sense. No. I think what he did, however, implied or implicit in the fact that Hegel stopped at point A with the dialectical thing, and Marx took it a step further to say that, okay, this dialectical method, when applied to society, leads to certain conclusions, and therefore what he was saying was that Hegel failed to go the next step, but we can't be too harsh on Hegel because Hegel would have been limited by the constraints of his time, which I suppose is an objective critique of Hegel. But implicit in that is that there was another step, which was Marxism, Marx and Engels' work on dialectics and historical materialism and so on. And he said, well, okay, that is now the step that one has to take. Now, anyway, so but you know, we can, I suppose, debate whether he felt, and he did admit that it was what we would call now Eurocentric. Okay. In the sense that he said this was a product of European thought and so on. And so Samir Amin, for example, who then deals with Eurocentrism, critiques Marx as also failing to take into account the experience outside of Europe. Okay. Yeah.
The African mode of production.
Right. And Amilcar Cabral, yes, in The Weapon of Theory, yes, says that in a sense Marx, if you take Marx literally, it would suggest that we in Africa cannot engage in revolutionary change because we don't have a history. Right. One of the debates I think we have to have in the Caribbean and in the Third World amongst people who both who have adopted Marxism as an ideological perspective, as a sociological methodology. Lennox Pear was one of my mentors, Trinidadian Marxist, always used to say, David, Marxism is a sociology, right? It is a method of analyzing. Don't look at the conclusions that Marx and Engels came to in Europe, because those were conclusions that applied to European society using the dialectical method. Don't look at what Lenin concluded in terms of Vanguard Party, in terms of the strategy and tactics of what is to be done, or any of those things, because those were important insights to Russian society in the period of 19 or whatever to 1917, 1919 and so on. What you have to do is to use the methodology and apply that now in a creative way to your own reality, and to see, using the dialectical method, what are the forces, what is taking place, how are people living, what are people doing. And I think that because James was a master dialectician, James did not easily fall into the trap of formulae. So he did not seek to look, which is why he was opposed to the Vanguard Party. And we had many arguments and so on about that. And then there were some who took James literally on the Vanguard Party and said, therefore we need no party. All we need is the assemblies of people. And there were those of us initially who had a position of vanguard party and said James was absolutely wrong. I think on a more mature reflection, we understood what James was saying on the party, which is not that the party is not necessary, but you cannot understand the party in the context, or you cannot seek to create the party of Lenin, because the party of Lenin was only applicable to Russia at that point in time in history and in the social and political conditions of Russia at that time. What you now have to do is to come up with the party of the working classes in your own specific reality at whatever date in time you are living, and so on. And so James was perhaps misunderstood on some questions, and I myself in my early days misunderstood James, and I think I came to a better understanding of James later on. But James was because he was a master dialectician, he constantly sought to do what we would say concrete analysis of concrete conditions. Yes? So we can critique Marx and Engels for their conclusions and their failure to understand, but then we have to also understand that they were prisoner of their moment. And what unfortunately many Marxists, in quote unquote, did in the Caribbean in the 60s and 70s and so on, and to some extent the 80s, was to seek to apply the conclusions of Marx, Engels, Lenin, whoever, Mao Zedong, whoever, seek to apply those conclusions to the specific Caribbean reality in which they existed, and therefore try to rationalize our reality to fit into the construct of the conclusion of other societies and other thinkers. So that people then try to define unemployed, for example. All unemployed in Trinidad and Tobago in the 70s was supposed to be lumpen proletariat, because by definition unemployed were lumpen. But the unemployed in Trinidad and Tobago in 1970 displayed radical and revolutionary behavior. In general, of course, there were elements who displayed traditional quote-unquote lumpen behavior. But so you have to look at, but maybe the unemployed in Trinidad and Tobago today may be displaying completely different behavior to the unemployed in the same Trinidad and Tobago, in the same communities 35 years ago. Why? We have to understand that. To understand that, we have to apply analysis, serious analysis to time and place and so on. So many people try to take something, Caribbean reality, and then cut and paste it, to use the modern terms, into fit the model of the conclusions that Marx and Engels and Lenin and others had come up with. James was saying no, that is wrong. That is in fact the antithesis of dialectics, because dialectics is supposed to be dynamic and applied to the here and now. And Best, for example, my challenge to Best was that Best then critiqued Marxists correctly, because he said they often sought to do that custom paste and therefore denied our own indigenous thinking of our own problems. But what he then did was to say that is because that happens, that is the result of the Marxist epistemology, which is European, 19th century Europe. My argument was that Marxist epistemology is the dialectical method which James used, right? And if we use Marxist epistemology, meaning dialectics, we can come up with a sociology and understanding of our own reality. I remember him living in our building, and we having union seminars dealing with politics and political economy and so on. And I would invite him to lecture. And he said, no, I just want to come and sit and listen. And then he would make a point every now and then, but you come and sit and listen. And then he would ask a question, what about so and so and so and so, and just take in the whole vibes of young workers in Trinidad in the late 70s, early 80s, and try to assimilate that into his own knowledge. Yeah.
That's an interesting view of education that he has, that education is not just classroom education, but the political organization and raising of consciousness as a result. But how do we translate that into our circumstances today, that we are engaged in classroom education for university students? How do we bridge that gap between his practice and his ideas about sociology of education?
Yes.
How do we educate students that are passionate about changing their society for the better?
Yes. At two levels, I suppose, and regrettably not enough has been done within the university in the formal sense. We have not had enough lecturers over the last 20 years who have challenged students to think like that and to expose students to James and others. I think that's beginning to shift a little bit, and so I'm glad to see it shifting. So that I certainly think that the formal system in the university of the semesters and all the courses and the routine of coursework, midterm, mid-semester deadlines, more coursework, end of semester, that students don't have the luxury, well, not luxury, the opportunity to think, which is what universities are supposed to be about. When I was at university, I didn't have to go to class, I didn't have to go to tutorial, I could talk on politics and argue things and be engaged in all kinds of stuff unrelated to anything else. Organize students, make alliances with students and workers and lecturers on campus. That's what I did. I was treasurer of the guild and president of the guild and a student activist here at St. Augustine. And I didn't go to class. Many subjects I just didn't go to class, never did a paper. But I learned a lot. I would suggest I learned more by not going to class in that formal sense than I may have learned by going to class in some of those instances. So I think that the system has become far too rigid and doesn't enable the opportunity for students to learn and engage. Because university is really supposed to be about ideas, about accessing new ideas, about challenging ideas, about testing ideas when people are young and minds are active and nimble and so on. So that's a real problem. And therefore I think we need to, in a sense, break up a lot of what is existing in terms of how we are doing what we are doing. Even our sixth forms, which are the entry point now for university, we now don't have one exam at the end of upper six. We now have an exam at the end of lower six with our CAPE system, another exam at the end of upper six. So whereas before lower six students used to be involved in a lot of stuff, now they can't be involved in a lot of stuff. Debates and these going to activities and so on. They can't do it because they have to prepare for one exam, then another exam. Far too exam oriented. So we have to, those of us who are conscious have to fight a battle within the system to try to change that system on the one hand, and we have to make whatever space exists to engage those with whom we come into contact as best as we can. And Walter Rodney wrote a very penetrating piece. It was actually an interview that we did with him when I was a student as president of the guild, and we brought Walter here in 1973, October, for orientation week to speak on the campus.
From London? He
was on his way back to Guyana from Africa.
Okay.
And we talked about the role of the university. It was reprinted in one of the publications that the WPA did and the conference organizers for the 25th anniversary conference of Walter in Guyana last two years ago, 25th anniversary of his death. And he talked about the role of the university. So you're saying, well, as an intellectual university, I have a responsibility to enlighten students in the best way I can. So he was saying, don't leave the university if you are an intellectual and academic, but recognize that you have a role to play within it. So those who are conscious of that role have to play that role of trying to enlighten students as best they can, and to create space, assist students in organizing fora, or if the faculty is not going to do it, in organizing fora, encouraging students to take part in discussions and so on, not just in their own narrow area. Econ department has something, come to that and engage and so on, so on, so on. And then we have to be doing it outside, which is what I'm doing, outside the university. So I engage with university students and with other young people and we study James, all right, and we study Marxism, and we study political economy and stuff like that, because James would have done it outside of the universities as well. He had his study groups. I'm sure Norman Gervin, if you interviewed him, talked about those study groups and so on. So he had those study groups, and so we need to use that praxis of study groups. And so the young people who are interested, those of us who are conscious, need to do that. I've been doing some of that. Whether it's going to be all that successful, it is successful, but we need to do more, yeah. And we're trying to do more and engage young people in exploring ideas, revolutionary ideas. In fact, we had a discussion, the theme of which was socialism or barbarism. And you know that one of James's groups in which he engaged, when was that? Maybe in the 40s, I'm not sure the precise date, was the group coming out of France, the English translation, which was socialism or barbarism. And right throughout his life, he talked about socialism or barbarism. I remember there was a panel discussion in one of the seminal book fairs, in 1983 or 84, that John LaRose organized in London, the International Book Fair of Radical Black and Conservative Books. And the theme of that was socialism or barbarism. And I think Kole, I'm trying to remember who was on that one. I think Kole Umotosho, BJ may have been on it as well, myself, James, Daka. So, a whole group of us, very, 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 very powerful discussion around that issue. So we need to do it within the academy to the extent that those can do that. We need to try to fight to reform and or transform the academy so that it becomes relevant in that way, and we need to work outside the academy in our informal, what best would call the informal, the academy outside that we have to create.
So would you agree with James's critique of Rodney, that he went too fast, too soon, too early into open political?
No, it wasn't that I agree with James's critique of Rodney. I mean, I was there with James when he wrote the telegram and sent to Walter, because he was in Trinidad at the time. Walter, be careful, Burnham will kill you.
Wow.
I went to Walter's trial in 1980, and the police and immigration people, I spoke at a public meeting a Sunday afternoon. I got in there midnight, Saturday night into Sunday morning. I spoke at a public meeting on Sunday afternoon. The police looked for me on Monday morning. I was deported Monday afternoon. Well, I was detained Monday afternoon and held overnight in the police station in Timeri Airport and deported on Tuesday morning and so on, and told don't come back to Guyana again. But Walter and I had a discussion on the Sunday afternoon, and that discussion was about Walter and what he was doing. And I said to him, CLR, all the commoners in Trinidad, our view is that you need to back off, you need to be careful, because we think that you could be killed. And Walter's response was, well, maybe if I get killed, that would spark the overthrow of Burnham. I said, well, it may, because I can't answer yes or no because I'm not in Guyana, I don't know the forces. It may, but if it doesn't, then what? Because you have a particular role to play in the uniting and mobilizing of Guyanese working people across the ethnic line, because you're the only one who could bring the Afro and Indo-Guyanese together in a force to bring down Burnham and by extension Jagan. Because you could not have Burnham and the PNC without Jagan and the PPP, because one fed off of the fact that the other had an ethnic base, and therefore both of them had an ethnic base. Not that Jagan was racist and so on, but that was how the politics worked. So that was the discussion Walter and I had, and 2 weeks after that he was killed. So James's pamphlet, which we study, Walter Rodney and the Question of Power, was a very important pamphlet. We agree with the critique that Walter made a fundamental mistake of not understanding insurrection, first of all, and the tactics of insurrection. And that, secondly, one cannot, which is related to the issue of insurrection, one cannot put yourself in the place of the masses, that it is a mass movement that is going to bring about change. Not a few revolutionaries, however correct you may be, And Walter was correct. But he said, you are not the one to bring out that revolution and change. And therefore, when the mass movement retreated, as it did after the strikes of 1979, Walter and they should have also retreated and built. Retreated in the sense of not seeking to engage the state in open confrontation. Okay? Yes, they had the public education, the demonstrations, the huge rallies, the building of consciousness, the building of the WP as a political organization. All that had to take place. But Walter then also went into a confrontation with the state in a direct way, not in the mass struggle, but by way of other means.
Yes.
Right? And that was James's critique. James is saying those means only arise at a particular moment in the insurrection. And that had not happened. You cannot make the insurrection. When the insurrection happens, you have to be ready for it. And you move that insurrection to the point of taking power.
Interesting.
Right? That was James's point. That yes, power is on the streets, and you must be ready to take power when that power is there to be taken. But you cannot try to take that power before and preempt it. And that was what he felt Walter was doing. And he said that Walter ought to have known better. And I think he was therefore terribly distressed, quite apart from his high regard for Walter as an individual, as a very important academic, as an important revolutionary, and as a person who had an important role to play in Guyanese and Caribbean society. He had a very high regard for Walter. And as a former student, as Walter being a former student of his. But I think he was very distressed by Walter's death, because he felt that Walter ought to have known better, that Walter had the benefit of knowledge and of other revolutionary experiences that should have prepared him for being patient. That Walter became too impatient.
That's a good take on that commentary. And I guess the same question could be asked about James himself. Was it a mistake for him to engage in intellectual struggles more? Should he have been more actively involved in a partisan politics, party politics, rather than the leading intellectual role he chose for himself?
Yeah, I mean, he was involved in actual organization at key points in time. In the Trotskyist movement at one time, then he broke with Trotsky. When he was in the United States, they were working with workers, building a revolutionary movement in the United States. But of course, in the context of the United States, that was not easy to do. And then particularly the post-war period with the whole McCarthy era and so on. So that was not easy to do. And then I think perhaps, and then of course he was in the Pan-African movement with Padmore. He in the United States, Padmore in England, and then later on both of them in England. At the earlier time when he joined Padmore in the struggle to defend Ethiopia and against the Italian invasion and so on. So there were key moments in which he was definitely involved in building movement. He was involved in the Pan-African movement towards, which pack was that? The fifth pack, was it?
Manchester.
No, the fifth pack was Manchester. Okay, so it must have been the one after, the one that he was working to happen, and then he broke.
Tanzania?
Yes, right.
Okay.
Which one was that one? The six pack?
The six.
Six pack, right. So he was working actively towards it and then broke when it went in the wrong direction. So he was involved in the organization. He was here in Trinidad with Williams trying to build the PNM, doing political education publicly through the nation, and then otherwise through internal party education, trying to build a serious party. And then when he realized that wasn't going anywhere, he left. So he was in and out of many important political organizations and contributed at key moments to those organizations. What he didn't do, if we want to critique him in that sense, or maybe one can, maybe James was just too large a person. I don't know. Maybe I'm being generous. I don't know. James did not, for example, say after he broke with Williams in Trinidad, I am going to stay in Trinidad and Tobago and build a radical revolutionary alternative to the PNM and the DLP at the time. He didn't do that. Can we fault him for that? I don't know. I haven't asked myself that question. I don't think we have discussed that in a serious way. We've talked about it. Yeah, but yes, we could fault him for that. That he should have stayed and fought it out with Williams to ally with the progressive workers movement. People like Lennox Pear did criticize James for that because Lennox never left Trinidad, but Lennox felt that you could remain and build, right, which is what he devoted his life to. James didn't do that. Perhaps James felt hurt by rejection of his own society. I don't know. Maybe the level of persecution was too great in terms of economic deprivation and so on. Maybe he felt that having done so much over 30 years before that on a world stage, that Trinidad and Tobago was not his stage, that he had another role to play. I don't know. I'm not aware of anybody having. There may be a conversation with him along those lines. I'm sure there have been conversations with him. I'm not aware of it. But it'd be interesting if there were those conversations to see what his answers were. I'm sure it's there. I don't remember it or not aware of it. But yes, in some respects, one could say James should have stayed here and fought to build a radical revolutionary movement. He left, and then of course he came back in he was here in 65 by accident, and he stayed until 66 with Workers and Farmers. So he did make an attempt, but that failed, and then he left again. Yes. So he was not here in 1970, whereas perhaps, and of course 1965-66 was a process to 1970. It was only 4 or 5 years afterwards. So if he had stayed and continued to build, right, and build after that, you know, though he had contacts, so he spoke, he had conversations. He was never totally absent from, but maybe he should have stayed.
Okay. One more comment.
Yeah.
The giants of Pan-Africanism were Trinidadian. Sylvester Williams, Padmore, James, Sekou Touré.
Not Sekou Touré.
Kwame Touré, sorry.
Yeah.
And many more, but they never called for any Pan-African Congress meeting here in Trinidad. I'm not saying it's a critique of them, it's probably a credit to their internationalism that they were not provincial or parochial in their thinking. But do you think such a Congress could be successfully hosted here with the support of ordinary people and grassroots organizations? The 8th Pan-African Congress, for example, to talk about strategies to fulfill those dreams that these giants had for us.
That's an interesting question. I never thought of that. Of course, if you look at the 5th Pan-African Congress, for example, and the work towards the 6th, there were important people from Trinidad and Tobago, leaders who participated in that. So if you look at the participation of the 5th, you will see trade union leaders. Yes. The president of my own union, I wasn't around, but John Rojas was there, and other labor leaders from Trinidad were there. So we were integral to the process, yes, but we were not, here was not the venue. And perhaps venue has been determined by factors that dealt with where is the center of the diaspora. In a sense, you know. In other words, London, in terms of Sylvester Williams, London for the 5th, Manchester, but the UK for the 5th, was a point at which there was an intersection, because there were people from the Caribbean living in London, there were people from Africa living in London, people who were involved in struggles in their own countries, but who happened to be in London at another point in time, or in UK at another point in time, and so on. So I certainly think that there was good reason for those early conferences being located in those places. And in terms of the 6th and the 7th, both of them were in Africa. I know there were people from the president of my own union, who is still president, Aaron McLeod, attended the one in Uganda,
yeah.
the 7th pack and so on. So I think there was a sense that for the 6th and the 7th, I'm speaking not from any serious analytical position, but just from my sense of it, is that the view was that the 6th and 7th had to be in Africa,
yes.
Centrally.
Yes.
And I think that the view would probably be that the 8th would have to be in Africa as well,
yes,
given the tremendous challenges that are taking place within Africa, of dealing with neo-colonial states, dealing with a whole set of contradictions in terms of the collapse of economies, of violence, of a whole range of issues and so on, of the struggle for independence, and then what next after the struggle for independence, the continuing struggle against elites that have emerged, throughout Africa and so on. I suppose the view would be that those questions and those contradictions have to be resolved centrally for there to be, or significantly, for there to be a powerful Pan-African movement. In other words, yes, those of us in the diaspora could engage in that, but to what extent can we be successful if the issues in Africa have not been resolved?
Yes, I think you're right. I was in Kampala for the 7th, and I vaguely remember a resolution saying that all future congresses should now be held in Africa. But we don't really look at the Caribbean as being outside Africa. It's part of the homeland in such a way, but
yeah,
it is a thought.
Yeah, it is a thought, and it's also interesting because while Trinidad and Tobago produced all these great Pan-African leaders, and while we had the most powerful manifestation of what was then called the Black Power movement in 1970, Trinidad, of course, is very multi-ethnic.
It is.
Yeah, which creates its own interesting challenges and so on. And therefore, to have the 8th or the 9th pack here would be a very interesting proposal. Because we would then have to address. All right, for example, there was a meeting in Barbados to which I was invited, did not go, but some of our people did go, which was a continuation of the Durban Conference on racism and xenophobia and so on. And I was very heavy in criticism of comrades who I know well, who organized that meeting in Barbados, who allowed it to degenerate to the point where people said, everyone here who is not visibly African has to leave the room.
Yes, that happened in Uganda as well. Because Benny Grant was there with his partner, and his partner was European. And so they would not let the partner go into sessions with Benny, and that was a whole lot of
yeah. There was a Cuban delegation at meeting in
Kampala?
No, well, in Barbados.
Oh yes, I saw them in Kampala.
Yeah, and some of the Cubans were European
yeah.
Cubans. They weren't, visibly African.
True.
And they were very upset because who more than the Cubans contributed to the liberation of Southern Africa?
Nobody else.
Exactly. So how do you then talk about Pan-Africanism, say to a white Cuban who may have fought in Angola or in Namibia and Angola, or whose brother or father may have died, right, and whose country endured severe economic and other kinds of hardships to sustain that struggle, how do you then say to that
You don't belong.
Cuban, you can't sit in this meeting?
No.
You know, there was somebody who I believe was African who was married to an Indian and whose child was there. So the child was mixed. Mother could stay, but the child can't stay. I would not have been allowed perhaps in that room.
Wow. That is.
In other words, if you want to take it like that, because I would say, for example, that my mother is Japanese.
Yeah.
My father looks African, but his grandmother was Indian. So where does that place me in the context of being African?
In the struggle.
Precisely,
Yes.
I'm in the struggle,
Yes.
right? And therefore, in other words, who organized the protests against apartheid and led the picketing of the Queen's Park Oval? I was one of the main leaders of that.
Okay.
I was very much part of the whole struggle against apartheid in Trinidad and Tobago, and solidarity with not me as an individual, but the union, and I was one of the leaders of the union, therefore involved in that sense. Where does that place me if you want to look at, whatever? So when I'm saying it will pose some challenges, it would pose challenges to those who view discussion around racism, around identity, and so on, from a very narrow perspective, place them in great difficulty, right? James himself,
Yes.
his last wife, Selma, is a Jew,
All right.
right?
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Okay. So where does Selma's son, Sam's last name is Weinstein.
Okay.
He grew up as James's son.
Okay.
Okay, he's active in the trade union movement